Tessa Calloway was standing in the middle of my kitchen at 11 on a Friday night, tying the strings of my old apron behind her back like she owned the place, and I was doing a very poor job of pretending I wasn't watching. The apron was dark blue, faded from too many washes, and it swam on her. She'd folded the top strap twice, and it still sat crooked at her collarbone. She kept adjusting it with one hand while reading something on her phone with the other, completely unbothered, like she hadn't just walked into my apartment 20 minutes ago, with a grocery bag in each arm and the specific look she got when she was about to cook through a problem she didn't want to talk about yet. "Let me," I said. She looked up. "I'm fine. You've adjusted that strap 4 times. She dropped her hand. "Fine." I stepped behind her and untied the strings, re-looped them higher, pulled them snug across the back of the apron, and tied them again at her waist. It took maybe 15 seconds. When I stepped back, she turned around and looked at herself, then at me. "Thank you," she said. Then quieter. "You didn't have to notice that. That was Tessa." She said thank you like it was something she owed you, not something she meant. I had met her 3 years earlier at a volunteer shift for a community kitchen in Logan Square. I was there because my coworker had signed me up, and I hadn't read the email carefully enough to realize I'd agreed to spend a Saturday peeling potatoes. She was there because she ran the sign-up form and apparently felt responsible for every person who showed up. She found me in the back room, holding a peeler, with the expression of someone who had never considered that potatoes had this many eyes. And she said, without introducing herself, "You're going to take forever. Come here." She taught me the correct angle in about 45 seconds, then moved on to the next problem, like I was just one item on a list she was working through. Her name was Tessa. She was 29 at the time, a pastry chef at a mid-sized restaurant in the West Loop. And she had opinions about butter that I didn't fully understand but respected completely. We became friends the way you become friends with someone who gives you correct instructions and doesn't make you feel stupid for needing them. Slowly, then constantly. For 3 years she had been the person I called when something went sideways. She called me when things went sideways for her, which she did less often, and usually framed as asking my opinion on something that she had already half figured out. We got dinner on Tuesday nights when both of us were free. She stole food off my plate. I let her, because she always picked the better thing to order, and some part of me knew it. I called her my best friend, because that covered the whole shape of it, without requiring either of us to look too closely at the shape. Tonight she was in my kitchen, because she had found out 3 days ago that the restaurant where she'd worked for 4 years was closing. Not folding quietly, not changing ownership. Closing. The chef owner had signed the lease on a place in Nashville, and the West Loop location was done by the end of the month. She had not cried when she told me. She had sat across from me at our usual Tuesday table and said, very carefully, "I need to figure out what I'm doing with my life. And I've decided the first step is making pasta from scratch in your kitchen, because my oven runs hot and ruins the mood." I had said okay. That was Thursday. Tonight was Friday, and she was already here, apron tied, phone out, flour on the counter before I'd even found my second coffee cup of the evening. I wasn't worried about Tessa professionally. She was talented in the specific way that made other people seem like they were working harder than they needed to. Recruiters had reached out to her before. She had options. What I was less sure about was the thing under the cooking. The part she hadn't said out loud yet. The part that lived in the way she'd folded that apron strap twice and kept adjusting it anyway. I leaned against the counter and watched her crack eggs into a well of flour with the kind of focus that meant she wasn't thinking about eggs at all. "You want to talk about it?" I asked. She kept her eyes on the bowl. "I'm talking about pasta. You're making pasta to avoid talking about something. I'm making pasta because carbohydrates are emotionally honest. That's a thing you made up just now." She glanced at me. It's still true. I let it go. That was also part of how things worked with us. She would circle back when she was ready. Usually around the time the first batch of something came out of the oven. While she worked the dough, I washed the dishes she'd dirtied, getting started, and didn't mention that I was doing it. She turned the dough out onto the floured section of my counter and pressed the heel of her hand into it in a slow, steady rhythm. The kitchen smelled like eggs and flour, and the rosemary plant on my windowsill that she had given me last spring and that I had somehow managed not to kill. I don't know what I want to do next, she said. To the dough, I waited. I know what I can do. I know what makes sense on paper. There's a group opening a new place in River North. They've already reached out. The backing is solid. She pressed into the dough again, and I don't feel anything when I think about it. That's useful information. She looked up. Is it? It tells you it's not the right move yet. She was quiet for a second. Then, what if the right move doesn't exist right now, and I just have to pick something? Then you pick something and adjust. But you don't have to decide tonight. She looked back down. I know. I just needed to hear that from someone who wasn't trying to solve it for me. I understand that, I said, and didn't add anything else. After a while, the pasta was resting under a damp towel and she was leaning against the opposite counter with a glass of water, and the kitchen had gone comfortable and quiet, the way it did late on Friday nights, when neither of us had anywhere else to be. She looked at me from across the small space. Can I ask you something? You can always ask me something. She tilted her head slightly. Do you ever get tired of being the person people call when things go wrong? I thought about it honestly. No. Why not? Because you only call me when things actually go wrong. You're not a person who manufactures crises. She considered that. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. I know your bar is low, I said. She laughed. It was a small laugh, but real, and it did something to the air in the room that I chose not to examine too closely. The pasta turned out well, as things Tessa made tended to do. We ate at my small kitchen table, with the window cracked even though it was October, because Tessa said the cold air made the food taste sharper. And I had stopped questioning her on things like that. She stayed until nearly 1, which was not unusual. What was slightly unusual was the way she looked around my apartment before she left, like she was taking inventory of something. The bookcase, I'd finally painted the right shade of gray. After she told me 3 times, the original color was wrong. The coffee maker she'd helped me pick out. The rosemary plant. She pulled on her coat and picked up her bag and said, without quite looking at me, "Thanks for tonight. I'm easy to cook for." That's not what I meant. I know, I said. She met my eyes for 1 second, then said good night and left. I stood in my kitchen that smelled like rosemary and pasta and the very faint trace of whatever she used in her hair, and I thought, we have been doing this for a long time, this careful thing. This thing, with all the right words for the wrong shape. Then, I turned off the lights and went to bed, because some things take longer to name than you expect. 3 weeks later, Tessa got the opportunity of her life, and everything almost fell apart in the same night. A chef she had worked under briefly 5 years ago, a woman named Corinna Park who had gone on to open 3 places in Chicago and 1 in D.C., called Tessa on a Tuesday morning and offered her the executive pastry chef position at her newest location. Not the River North Group, not the safe paper makes sense option. This. A place that wasn't open yet. That was still 3 months from its first service. That came with real creative control. And a team Corinna was building from scratch. Tessa told me about it standing outside the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, before she'd even come inside, like she'd been holding it in the whole walkover and couldn't keep the lid on it anymore. Corinna Park, she said, called me. This morning. Me. I know who you are, I said. She exhaled. She wants me to run the pastry program. Full menu, full team, I hire the sous. That's exactly what you should be doing. I know. She looked at me. I'm terrified. Of course you are. It's the right thing. The right things are always a little terrifying. She stared at me for a second, like she was trying to decide if I was being sincere or diplomatic. Then decided I was being sincere, which I was. The soft opening was set for a Friday in November, 5 weeks out. Tessa said yes to Corinna on Wednesday. By Thursday, she was already working 12-hour days in the new kitchen, getting the feel of the equipment, the layout, the variables. I saw her for 45 minutes on Sunday, when she came over to return a book she'd borrowed and stayed long enough to eat half a sandwich. And tell me, the reach-in cooler ran 2 degrees cold, and she'd already accounted for it. She looked tired and sharp, and more like herself than she had since the West Loop closing. I noticed both things and said neither. The soft opening was invitation only. 20 tables, industry guests, food press, a few investors. The kind of night that either built a reputation or quietly set a ceiling. Tessa had been treating it with the calm efficiency of someone who had already decided it would go well, and was now simply doing the work to make that true. She had planned to go alone, or rather, she hadn't planned a +1, because she hadn't thought about anything outside the kitchen in 5 weeks. On the Wednesday before the opening, she texted me at 7 in the morning. "Will you come Friday? You don't have to do anything. I just think I'll feel better if there's someone in the room I don't need to be impressive for." I was already awake. I texted back, "I'll be there." She sent back, "Thank you." Then, a minute later, "Wear something that doesn't embarrass me." I sent back a photo of the jacket she'd told me to buy 8 months ago, and had never seen me actually wear. She sent back a single thumbs up that somehow conveyed both approval and mild irritation, which was impressive for an emoji. On Friday I got to her apartment at 6 to walk over together. She opened the door in a burgundy dress that was simple and exactly right, her hair back, earrings that caught the light, the expression of a person who had been ready for an hour but didn't want to look like it. She looked at my jacket. "Good," she said. "You look." She shook her head slightly, cutting me off. "Don't. I'll get nervous." I stopped. "Okay." She picked up her bag, then stopped at the door and turned back. "Sorry, you can say it. You look like you've already won," I said. "Like the night is just catching up." She went still for half a second, her chin dropped slightly. Then she said, quietly, "That's not how a friend says that." I could have walked it back. I had walked things back before, plenty of times, with a well-placed joke or a redirect, or just the steady practice of not finishing the sentences I should have said years ago. I could have said "you're right," or I meant it as a compliment or something that put a safe frame around it and moved us toward the door. I didn't. "I know," I said. The room rearranged itself after that. Same hallway, same lamp by the door, same coat hook. I'd helped her install 18 months ago. But something had shifted, the way a window shifts when someone finally cracks it open after a long winter. Her phone buzzed on the entry table. She looked at the screen, and everything in her face changed to focused. "Corinna," she said. "Something's already off," she answered. I watched her move into the kitchen while she talked, pacing the small space, already problem-solving in her posture. She said, "Yes, I know. And tell Marco to hold the 3rd course. And if the chocolate has bloomed, we can work around it. It's a texture, not a flavor." She hung up and turned to me. "The tempering station is running inconsistent. One of the induction burners is throwing off heat. Is that fixable tonight?" She was already putting on her coat. "Everything is fixable tonight. That's the job." She stopped at the door again. This time she didn't turn around fully, just looked at me over her shoulder. "When we get there," she said. "If I get stuck in my head, just stand somewhere I can see you." She didn't wait for an answer. She opened the door and we went. The restaurant was called Linden, and from the outside it looked like it wasn't trying very hard. Which was the point. A narrow frontage on a side street in the West Loop. Warm light behind frosted glass. a single wood panel above the door, with the name in small letters. The kind of place that made you feel like you'd been told about it by someone who wanted you specifically to know. Inside it was something else entirely. The ceiling was high, the walls were pale plaster, with the texture left in. The tables were dark walnut, and set close enough to feel intimate, without being crowded. A long bar ran along one side, and at the back, through a pass-through window, you could see the kitchen moving. Tessa stopped just inside the door for exactly 2 seconds, took a breath, and became the version of herself that the room needed. Shoulders back, smile in place, eyes already scanning the space for what needed her attention first. Her sous pastry chef, a lanky guy in his mid-20s named Oliver, appeared out of nowhere. He looked stressed in the precise way of someone who had identified every possible problem and was now holding them all at once. Tessa looked at him. "Tell me the burner situation." "We've compensated." Drew redistributed the mise en place to the working stations. "The ganache is stable. The petit fours? Ready and holding. The plated components for table demos? Waiting on the raspberry coulis to reach temperature, but it's close." Tessa gave him a single nod. "Good. Who else knows about the burner?" "Corinna and me. Keep it that way." Tessa touched his arm briefly. "You handled it well. Now, go act like everything is going exactly as planned." Oliver breathed. "Right, okay." He walked away like someone who had just been reminded he was capable. I leaned close to Tessa. "You terrify him a little." "Good," she said, without moving her smile. "He works better with healthy respect than with comfort." She turned to greet a woman I recognized from a food publication, and then she was in it, fully, the way she always was at events she ran, moving through the room like she belonged in every conversation, light and precise, the kind of present that made people feel singled out. I found a position near the bar, where I was useful without being in the way. A server asked if I was with the restaurant, and I said I was with the pastry chef, which was true in the ways that mattered. I held coats when people came in from the cold. I pointed a couple to the restrooms when they were turned around. I caught the eye of a server who was about to deliver a course to the wrong table, and redirected her without making it obvious. Tessa passed me once near the bread service station, and said, without stopping, "You're doing the thing where you fix things without being asked." I said, "Old habit," she said. "I know," and kept walking. Every few minutes I found her in the room. She touched Oliver's shoulder while he plated. She spoke quietly to a member of the floor team. She paused to answer a question from one of the investors, with the kind of patience that looked effortless and wasn't. But I had known her long enough to read the margins. The way her hand pressed briefly to her sternum, when she thought no one was watching. The way her smile went half a degree too steady when something was taking longer than she'd planned. I found her near the service corridor about 40 minutes into the evening, standing still for the first time all night, looking at her phone. "You're doing the thing," I said. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet and your posture gets too correct." She looked up. "That's not a thing." "It's definitely a thing, for you specifically." She exhaled. "The raspberry component is running 4 minutes behind. It's not a crisis. It just means every subsequent course adjusts. And I need to tell Corinna before she hears it from the floor." "Tell Corinna. 4 minutes is nothing." "I know." She was still looking at her phone. "Then, do you think it's going well, the room?" I looked past her at the dining area. People were leaning across tables. Nobody was checking their phones. The press table had the specific quality of attention that meant they were paying attention. "Yeah," I said. "It's going really well." She followed my gaze. "Okay, Tessa." She looked at me. "You built this," I said. "Not Corinna, not Oliver. You. Everything in that kitchen came from you figuring it out in 5 weeks, on a burner that runs inconsistent." She stared at me for a second too long. Then someone said Tessa from across the room, and she moved. "I got you a sparkling water," said a voice beside me. I turned. A man about my height, good suit, easy smile, holding 2 glasses. He handed one to me without asking if I wanted it. I knew who he was before he said his name. I knew the way you know the shape of a thing before you see it clearly. "I'm Derek," he said. "I know Tessa from a couple years back. We dated for a while." I said my name and shook his hand. He looked out toward the room. "She looks great. Incredible night for her." His voice was smooth. No edge I could point to. "Then she always did better with a crowd. Hard to get the same version of her when it's just the 2 of you. She kind of disappears into whatever she's building." I looked at him. He smiled. "Occupational hazard of loving someone who works this hard. Eventually you realize you're competing with the kitchen." I kept my face easy. "That sounds like a you problem, not a her problem." His smile thinned a degree. "Maybe. She's worth it though. That's the thing. You keep trying because you keep thinking eventually she'll let you in all the way." There it was. The thing with a reasonable-sounding exterior and a rot in the middle. Not a clean lie. A half-truth delivered to make me see her sideways. I looked at him directly. "Tessa doesn't disappear. She invests. There's a difference. The people who say she's hard to reach usually mean she didn't make enough room for their needs alongside her own. That's a specific thing. And it's not the same as being closed off." He didn't have a smooth response ready for that. He covered it with a sip of his drink. I excused myself and went to find Tessa. She was in the short corridor beside the dessert station, standing with Oliver while he showed her something on a small tablet. She looked over when I came in. Oliver glanced between us. "I'll go check the plating line." He disappeared. Tessa looked at me. "Derek?" I nodded. She looked at the wall for a second. "He's here with someone from the press table. He told me at the beginning of the night it was great to see me, and I have been successfully avoiding him since. He told me you disappear into your work." Her jaw tightened slightly. Of course he did. He's not entirely wrong about what he observed. He's entirely wrong about what it means. She looked at me. There was something open in her face, something tired underneath the capable surface. "He used to say, I didn't know how to let people see me," she said. "That I kept everyone at the same polite distance." I looked at her. "You let me fix your apron at 11 at night when you're spiraling." She blinked. "You called me from a parking lot in February when the caramel didn't set. And you needed to think out loud for 12 minutes. You told me about your dad's health thing in March, before you told your sister. You let me sit in the kitchen while you work, and you don't do that for anyone. Oliver included." Tessa stared at me. "You don't keep everyone at the same distance," I said. "You just have a short list. And I'm on it, which I do not take lightly." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Why do you say things like that?" "Like what?" "Like that. Like you've been paying attention to me longer than I knew." "I have been," I said. The corridor got very small. Not uncomfortably. Just smaller than it had been. Her phone went off. She looked at it. "Back of house," she said. "I have to go." She started past me, then stopped. Her hand came to my arm briefly. "Don't go anywhere," she said. "I'm easy to find." She held my gaze for 1 second. Then she went back to her kitchen. Lyndon's soft opening finished just after 11. The last table cleared. The floor team started quiet cleanup. And Corinna stood at the host stand, talking to the investor couple, with the specific calm of someone watching a good number come together. Oliver sat at the bar, with his head in his hands, in a way that meant relief, not distress. Tessa came out of the kitchen, just after the final dessert course went out. She had taken off her chef's jacket, and was in the simple black shirt she'd worn underneath. Her hair had come loose at the back. Her lipstick was faded. She looked less like the person who had walked into this restaurant at the beginning of the night, and more like the person I knew best, the one who was harder for most people to earn. Corinna crossed the room and took both of Tessa's hands in hers, and said something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. Tessa nodded, looked at the floor, nodded again. When Corinna moved on, Tessa stood still for a second, with her eyes closed, just breathing. Then she found me across the room and came straight over. Oliver wants to debrief the burner situation tomorrow, she said. Corinna is happy. The raspberry component came out at minute 6, and apparently the weight made table 7, like the pacing better. Crises becoming features, I said. She sat down on the bar stool beside me. She took off one shoe, then the other, and set them on the floor. She sighed like she'd been saving it. I said, "There she is." She looked at me sideways. "Don't start." I was going to say, "You did exactly what you said you would do." She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure I could. "I know." She looked down at the bar. The back of the restaurant had gone quiet. Oliver had fallen asleep in his arms at the far end. A server was folding linen with the slow movements of someone going through a familiar routine. Tessa turned toward me. "What you said in the corridor," she said. "About the list." "Yeah." She looked at the bar top. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it." "I know." She turned to look at me directly. "But I think I want to." I looked at her. "I have been treating you like a category," she said. "Best friend," because that was the word that made everything fit without me having to admit that it fit a little too well. She paused. "And I think I've been doing that for longer than I want to say out loud." I said, "How long?" She almost smiled. "Longer than is flattering." I let that sit for a second. Then I said, "For what it's worth, I've been on the same side of that problem." She looked at me carefully. Yeah. The bar went quiet. Oliver was definitely asleep. The server had gone to the back. Corinna had stepped outside with the investors. Tessa looked at my hand on the bar. Then she put hers over it, not dramatically, just rested it there, warm and settled. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "The part where you say the thing out loud and then everything has to adjust." "Neither am I. But I don't want to keep not saying it." "Then don't," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. The way she looked at something she was about to commit to. "I drove you home once after a bad day," she said. "You'd had that thing with the project and you didn't want to talk. You just needed not to be alone. You fell asleep in the passenger seat and I drove around for 20 extra minutes because I didn't want to wake you up." "I've never told you that," I said. "Tessa. I made a reason to go to the hardware store with you last spring because I knew you'd pick the wrong paint and I wanted to be there when you figured it out." I looked at her hand. On mine. "I bought the rosemary plant because I wanted you to have something in your apartment that needed looking after," she said, "and because I was the one who was going to check on it." Write in the comments. Was Tessa right to wait as long as she did? Or should she have said something before one almost perfect night forced it out? Tell me below. I reached over and tucked a loose piece of her hair back behind her ear. She let me. Her breath went quiet. "You are the only person," I said, "who has ever been more careful with me than I am with myself." She looked at me for a long second. "I've been in love with you," she said. "For a while now. I just kept calling it something else. That's all it took. 3 years of Tuesday dinners and food stolen off my plate, and conversations at midnight in my kitchen, and the particular way she had of fixing things without making you feel like they were broken. All of it settled into place. Not changed, just named. I kissed her at the empty bar while Oliver slept at the end of it. And the restaurant held its breath after a good first night. She kissed me back, like she'd made a decision and was done reconsidering it. Her free hand came to the front of my jacket. Not pulling me anywhere, just resting there, certain. When we stopped, her forehead came to mine. "I'm still going to steal your food," she said. "I know, and I'm not going to suddenly become the person who talks about feelings at breakfast. I know that too." She pulled back just enough to look at me properly. "I'm very tired. I know. And my feet hurt and Oliver is asleep on the bar, and Corinna is going to come back inside in about 3 minutes. Then we should probably look less like this," I said. She smiled. "A real one. The kind that wasn't for the room." "Probably," she agreed, and didn't move. I walked her home just after midnight. Same as I had 100 other nights. The difference was her hand in mine the whole way, and the way neither of us narrated it. Because some things don't need explaining when they finally become what they were always going to be. At her building, she stopped at the door and looked at me. "Come up," she said. "I'll make tea and you can sit in the kitchen while I decompress." That sounds like every other night. She looked at me steadily. "It's not every other night." "No," I said, "it isn't." She unlocked the door. Inside her apartment it was warm, and it smelled like the cardamom candle she kept on the kitchen windowsill. She put the kettle on, and I sat at the counter, and she moved around the small kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who wasn't performing anything anymore. She stopped in front of the stove and looked at me over her shoulder. "There is one thing I need," she said. "What's that?" She lifted her hair off the back of her neck and waited. "The apron strings," I said. She laughed. "The ties on the dress. Same thing." I got up. She turned her back to me, hair held up in one hand. I found the small tied bow at the back of her dress and worked it loose slowly. This time I wasn't pretending it was nothing. She wasn't pretending either. When I finished, she let her hair fall and turned around. "You've been buttoning and unbuttoning things for me since the beginning," she said. "Someone had to." She looked at me for a moment with something open and warm, and no longer carefully labeled. "Good thing it was you," she said. A month later, the Linden team called the soft opening the best night a new restaurant had gotten in years, which I heard secondhand because Tessa mentioned it between bites of the breakfast she was making in my kitchen on a Saturday morning. Barefoot, wearing the dark blue apron she had apparently decided lived at my place now, she still told me about kitchen problems I didn't fully understand. I still showed up to her events and fixed the things she didn't have time to fix herself. She still stole the better half of whatever I ordered. Nothing important had changed. It had just finally been given the right name.